Under a blood-red sunset, the remote countryside lay shrouded in an eerie stillness, where the rice fields stretched out like an old, faded carpet worn by time. Another day passed in Diep's life, but today the last light of day was not merely an end. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one steeped in sorrow, sacrifice, and fragile hope. Episode 9 opens with the image of Diep standing silently in the middle of a rural market, her thin hands clenching a bamboo cane as her sorrowful eyes wandered over the passers-by. Her face, now marked with bruises, mirrored the unspoken pain she had endured during the days of being held captive by her past. In the small house of the Powell family, where she had been forced to return to protect Uncle Keen, the atmosphere was heavy with a dark shroud. The cold wind whispered through the cracks in the door, carrying with it the breaths of painful memories, the lashes, the scoldings, and the tears she had once tried to hide. Di stood by the flickering hearth, the faint light from the flame casting delicate shadows over her face, accentuating both old scars and new wounds. "I chose to come back to protect Uncle Kian," she murmured to herself, her voice blending with the crackling of burning wood. "But I don't know how much longer I can endure." At the CI office, beneath the radiant glow of dazzling chandeliers that illuminated every corner of the room, James sat quietly at his desk, his eyes heavy with worry. Before him lay impressive revenue figures: 50 billion from agricultural products, 30.5 billion from timber, but none of these could soothe his bleeding heart. News of Diep, of her being confined within the Powell family home, had reached him, through whispered messages from the security team. "Diep, why don't you talk to me?" he wondered aloud, his voice lost in the silence. He rose and stepped out onto the balcony, where he could see the distant fields, the very same fields where Diep was silently enduring pains he could not reach. That morning, as the first light had yet to chase away the thick fog, James left the office and headed to a small roadside cafe where he unexpectedly met Tung, an old acquaintance who had once inquired about purchasing a pomelo orchard. Beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns, Tung sat across from James, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "I heard you've been back in Vietnam for a while, but today is our first meeting. I wanted to ask about your pomelo orchard. Have you sold it yet?" James managed a faint, wry smile. "Not yet. The price isn't right. I have 1,000 pomelo trees, mostly green-skinned and sugar pomelos." Tung nodded, his tone warm and measured. "I was thinking of offering 1.1 billion, but could you give me a little discount?" James paused for a moment, his eyes drifting into silent contemplation. "I can knock off 50 million, since we've known each other for so long," he replied, though his voice trailed off, as if his soul were drifting to another place, a place where Diep was suffering pains he could not prevent. Noticing something amiss, Tung quietly asked, "Is something wrong? You seem dazed." James sighed. "I've got some personal matters." The brief conversation ended, but inside James, a flame of determination began to blaze. He knew that to save Diep, he would have to sacrifice more, not just money, but also the dreams he once nurtured for the Yayoi company. "I won't let you suffer any longer," he whispered, his eyes reflecting a resolute determination against a darkening sky. At that rural market on that day, under the faint midday sun, Diep stood silently by the tomato stand, her trembling hands arranging the ripe fruits into a bamboo basket. Her face, now marked with bruises, drew whispered comments from passers-by. "Is that girl beaten?" someone murmured, but Diep only lowered her head, her eyes empty as if she were used to such stares. Suddenly, hurried footsteps resounded, and before she could react, a strong hand grasped hers, pulling her away from the crowd. "Diep," James's deep voice rang out, laced with worry and anger, standing before her, his eyes swept over the wounds on her face, his heart seemingly cut with every glance. "Why do you have these injuries? We need to go to the hospital immediately." But before he could lead her away, a familiar figure appeared. Mrs. May, Diep's ex-mother-in-law, stepping forward with a cold, sharp gaze. "You bastard! How dare you lay a hand on my daughter-in-law?" she snapped, her hand raised as if to intervene. James turned back, his voice resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Diep, have you been abused? Tell me and I'll protect you." But Diep backed away, her eyes revealing a mix of fear and resignation. "No, I just fell," she whispered. Her words struck James like a dagger, yet he refused to believe them. "How can a simple fall cause such injuries?" he roared, his eyes blazing with fury. "We must get to the hospital right away." Mrs. May interjected coldly. "This is a family matter. Who are you to interfere? You're the president of a big company. Don't make a farce out here in the market." James said nothing in response. He only fixed his gaze on Diep, his eyes full of unspoken pain. "Diep, why did you come back here?" "I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. But Diep merely bowed her head, clutching the edge of her blouse. "I came back on my own. Don't worry about me," she replied. Inside James, a flame of determination ignited. He could not let Dieppe continue to suffer, no matter what she said. He left the market in haste, heading straight for the police station, where he met Mr. Tai, a former friend from the force. In the dim light of a small room, James sat facing Mr. Tai, his tone resolute. "I suspect Dieppe is being abused and forced to stay at the Powell household. Can you help me verify this?" Mr. Tai nodded, his eyes serious. "I remember Dieppe. She once managed to escape. Why would she come back voluntarily? If there's evidence, we'll head there immediately." James recounted the bruises on Dieppe's face in a lowered voice. "I believe she's being coerced. A person who comes back willingly would never have such terrified eyes." Mr. Tai agreed, and the two quickly set off, the rumbling jeep driving along the dusty red roads. At the Powell house, tension hung thickly in the air as James and Mr. Tai arrived. Mrs. May stood at the door, her eyes betraying a hint of panic. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. Mr. Tai responded in a firm tone. "We received word that Dieppe is being abused. Bring her out here." Mrs. May forced a laugh. "That's ridiculous. My daughter-in-law. I love her more than anyone in this area," but James remained unconvinced as he stepped inside, his gaze scanning every corner. "Where is Dieppe?" Mr. Tai ordered authoritatively. Mrs. May replied quickly. "She went to dig cassava. She's not at home." Yet a small noise from the back of the house caught James's attention. He moved forward, and there, Dieppe appeared, her hands trembling, her face marred by bruises. "Dieppe," James called, his voice choking with emotion. Mrs. May hurried in. "She just fell, that's all." Mr. Tai advanced, his tone firm. "Dieppe, please, raise both hands." Slowly, Dieppe complied, though her trembling hands revealed numerous bruises. "Did you come here of your own free will, or were you forced?" he asked sharply. Dieppe lowered her head and whispered, I came back on my own." James stepped back, his heart seemingly ripped apart. "Dieppe, why are you lying? I know you were forced." Mrs. May interjected. "She came back voluntarily. If not, she would have lost her home. Don't meddle in our family affairs." Yet James could not take his eyes off Dieppe. In her gaze he saw a silent pain that spoke volumes. "Dieppe, I promise I will save you," he murmured, his voice resonating like a vow amid the tense atmosphere. James left the Powell household, his heart heavy yet his determination unshaken. He and Mr. Tai headed to Uncle Kian's house, the very source of all the suffering Dieppe had endured. Under the dim glow of an oil lamp in the humble thatched house, Uncle Kian sat by the hearth, his eyes filled with sorrow as he saw James and Mr. Tai enter. "What brings you here?" he asked in a hoarse voice. James sat down and in a deep yet resolute tone said, "7 years ago, you sold Dieppe in exchange for 2 buffaloes, didn't you?" Uncle Keen nodded, his eyes brimming with regret. "That's right, I was poor, I had no other choice." James sighed. "I have 80 million VND. I want to redeem Dieppe. You must come with me." Uncle Keen looked up, his voice trembling. "I love Dieppe dearly, but I don't have the money to redeem her. If you have it, then I will go." James stood up, his eyes firm with determination. "I'll take care of the money, but you must come with me. Dieppe is your kin. Help me free her." Uncle Keen nodded, his hands clenching as if to hold on to a final hope. The three quickly set off, the jeep roaring along the dusty red roads, carrying their resolve to rescue Dieppe from the shackles of her past. At the Piao residence, as the late afternoon light waned, James and Uncle Kien entered, facing the astonished gazes of Mr. Chu and Mrs. May. "Today, I'm here to redeem Dieppe," James declared, his voice resonating with authority. Mrs. May scoffed. "What's with all this money? What are you doing?" But James said nothing, merely glancing at Uncle Kien, who stepped forward with a contrite look. "Back in the day, I sold Dieppe for 2 buffaloes out of desperation. Today, I have the money. I'm redeeming my own niece." James placed the 80 million VND on the table, his eyes cold and unwavering. "This is the redemption money. From now on, do not trouble Dieppe again." Mrs. May picked up the money, her eyes gleaming with greed. "All right, as long as there's money." Mr. Chu sighed and said in a somber tone, "Where is Dieppe? Call her here." Powell staggered in, his eyes bloodshot. "You're redeeming Dieppe? I want a cut of the money." But Mrs. May waved him off. "Don't interfere. This is my money." Dieppe emerged from a corner of the house, her face marked with injuries, but her eyes filled with a mix of bewilderment and pain. "Uncle Kien?" "James," she whispered, her voice catching. Uncle Kien approached, his eyes glistening with tears. "Dieppe, I'm sorry, my dear. Now I'm redeeming you. Don't be sad anymore. Dieppe lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't want anything. I only wish for a little dog as my friend. James looked at Dieppe, his heart full of sorrow. Dieppe, you are free now. I sacrificed everything to save you. He then turned to the Powell family. I'm giving an extra 20 million VND. From now on, leave her alone. Mrs. May nodded coolly. Fine, money talks. Dieppe stepped out of the house, accompanied by a small dog, her eyes shining with a new, albeit painful, hope. Thank you, James. Thank you, Uncle, she said, her voice trembling. I'm sorry I couldn't do more for you. Uncle Keene took her hand gently. Don't worry, dear. I regret selling you. I'll repay James slowly with this money. James shook his head, his tone gentle yet firm. No repayment is necessary. I did this because I saw how much you were suffering, but I will not force you to stay with me. Dieppe, you decide your own future. Dieppe looked up, her eyes reflecting gratitude. I want to return to the farm and work to repay my debt to you, James. James smiled softly. It's up to you. I'll help you get there. On the way back to the farm, the jeep sped along the dusty red roads carrying Dieppe, James, and the little dog. When the vehicle came to a stop, Dieppe stepped out, her legs trembling, and suddenly she collapsed. Dieppe, James shouted, rushing over to catch her. He quickly made a call. Get a doctor here right away. Dieppe has fainted. Cradling her in his arms, he murmured in anguish. I've come too late, Dieppe. Dr. Twee arrived promptly. Under the dim glow of the farm's lights, he examined Dieppe and sighed. She's simply exhausted. Some rest will do her good. James nodded, his eyes never leaving Dieppe's. Thank you, doctor. When Dieppe awoke, she found herself lying on an old wooden bed, with James sitting beside her, holding a bowl of steaming porridge. Dieppe, are you awake? He asked, in a voice as gentle as a spring breeze. Dieppe managed a weak smile. Thank you, James, for saving me. James blew on the porridge before offering it to her. Eat up. I want nothing more than for you to live well. Tears streamed down Dieppe's face as she looked at him. No one has ever treated me as kindly as you. I don't know how to repay you. James shook his head. Your happiness is the greatest repayment. In that moment, a newfound glimmer of hope shone in Dieppe's eyes. She realized that despite a painful past, the future could still open new doors, a place where she could be free, where she could truly live for herself. Sitting by her side, James's heart brimmed with hope. I sacrificed my company to save you, and I have no regrets. As long as you're happy, everything is worthwhile. Episode 9 concludes with the image of Dieppe lying on the bed, the little dog curled up by her side, and James vigilantly watching over her throughout the night. Beneath the soft glow of the moon, the farm transformed into Dieppe's new sanctuary, a place where she could mend old wounds, where the love and sacrifice of James had ignited a spark of hope in her heart. Yet deep down, Dieppe still wondered, do I deserve this love? And James, with his endless patience, quietly whispered, I will wait. I'll always be here when you need me.